It's an incredibly beautiful spring day here in the Adams County fruit belt, orchard country, and the trees are in maximum blossom right now. Just very, very lovely today. Um, all right, was somewhat of impulsive or eccentric choice. I decided to end the course with selections from Patricia J. Williams's Alchemy of Race and Rights. This is a book published in 1991, or a collection of essays, and really a stunning piece of work, I think. Patricia J. Williams is a law professor. I think I should have looked this up a second ago, at Columbia, and she writes a column, The Diary of a Mad Law Professor, for The Nation magazine, where she still writes in this kind of intensely personal and yet also intensely intellectual way. And, so for one thing, she's not a philosophy professor. All right, she's a law professor. Of course, law has been a theme throughout the course in various ways, though this is not a philosophy of law course. But the concepts many of the concepts she's throwing around in these essays are, of course, concepts that we talked about elaborately, such as rights and property, the individual versus the collective, that we've been working on since Marx in some ways, or at least since Locke, since Plato. All right, these individual collective questions. Is the primary subject or the thing of most importance the individual human being, or the polis as a whole, or different kinds of groupings of human beings, such as class, gender, race? Williams emerges partly from the kind of feminist discourse that we saw. She's certainly got stuff like Virginia Held on board, I would think. But she's doing a variety of other things. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to is that she's critiquing the classical liberal tradition, among other things, maybe Western culture as a whole. Right? And one way she's doing that is by the way she writes. Right? It's intensely personal, intensely poetic, in a way that draws you into thinking that personal experience is, first of all, often or even always emblematic of a social, legal situation or a cultural situation. And I think it draws your attention to the ways the texts we've been reading are written in this kind of neutral, objective tone that Williams specifically attacks as a kind of a dimension of oppression, like the claim to objectivity, the claim to access knowledge in a privileged way, is made just by the way one writes in certain ways. And a great paradigm of this, I guess, is the philosophical tone, neutral, abstract, all right, non-personal, often at least. So, I mean, what she says right on the first page of these selections, that she's concerned with subject position above all. These are kind of terms in postmodern theory in some ways that we're probably not going to be able to discuss elaborately. But she says, since subject position is everything in my analysis of the law, you deserve to know that it's a bad morning. I'm very depressed. It always takes a while to sort out what's wrong, etc. Okay? What she's doing is owning what she's saying. Subject position, where she's speaking from. She's going to make that clear. And she thinks that's relevant in certain ways to the sorts of insights that she can bring. So the fact that she's a black woman, as well as many other factors in her personal life, that some of which she describes in these essays, um, are relevant to the issues at hand, or potentially give you access to different kinds of uh, information that might be relevant to even to assessing the truth of theories or the motivation behind them. All right, now so let me say something about my own subject position very briefly. You should think about who is presenting to you this feminist material. I should think about this. You don't have to think about it, but you might want to think about it. I need to think about it. Who is it that's presenting this material, for example, from the feminist or critical race perspectives? It's me that's framing this discourse for you, from, trying to incorporate women's voices and, voices of other sorts of people. And I'm a white man, okay? So in a certain way, if subject position is significant, if the neutral objective tone is a kind of illusory subject position, it's called the unmarked subject position in this tradition of theory. I need to think about what I am doing when I frame this material. Is it a kind of cultural appropriation or whatever? Or, on the other hand, would it be irresponsible to teach a course in political philosophy and not bring other voices to bear? I guess that's what I think. That's my justification. But I'm worried about my ability to speak to these things. Or, I feel like I have expertise with regard to Plato and Hobbes or whatever, okay? I don't necessarily have any, I don't have the right kind of expertise in certain ways. I've done the reading, right? But I haven't lived the life. And Patricia Williams is saying that's irrelevant, okay, to political philosophy. Where you're speaking from gives you access to different sorts of knowledge or different dimensions of truth. All right. This, on the intellectual level or the more abstract philosophical level, this material amounts to a critique of classical liberalism. So we've certainly seen that happen already in Marx, in Held, and we've seen it, defended on feminist grounds by Nussbaum, classical liberalism. But I think that's one implicit target. It's the idea of, and it's connected to Marx's critique, the idea that individual rights, which sound like a liberatory rhetoric or a liberatory program as a basis of a political system, hides all sorts of oppressive capacities, or is even designed fundamentally for certain kinds of oppression, right? And that the doctrine of individual rights and also of free exchange, free markets, might be a white male rhetoric, as Marx says, it might be a bourgeois rhetoric, right? And people, just straight up, slavery is a theme in Williams' work. She's descended from slaves, all right? And property and the right to own property looks somewhat different from the point of view of a slave or someone descended from slaves than it does the right to own property, right? The natural rights of man look somewhat different if you are property, all right? If people think you are property. All right. So anyway, I want to just read some Williams because I do think she's such a fine writer, right, and such an interesting writer. She says this. So you should know that this is one of those mornings when I refuse to compose myself properly. You should know you are dealing with someone who is writing this in an old terry bathrobe with a little fringe of blue and white tassels dangling from the hem, trying to decide if she's stupid or crazy. Right? Try to imagine Karl Marx or John Locke writing, writing like that. you know, bringing you right into the situation right now. It's me, Patricia Williams, a certain kind of person in a certain place with a certain biography, writing this morning, all right? And what's happening this morning, and where I'm at specifically this morning, what's happening in the world, and where I'm at in this morning, are connected in various ways. Maybe you can see that with the virus stuff or whatever. And so I'm going to bring that to bear. And plus, I'm going to share with you where I'm speaking from, who is speaking. And I just feel like that's something that's really been absent from most of the texts that we've read. And then she says this, and this is published in 1991. Right? Conditions are bad, very bad, all over the world. The newscasters tell me that everyone is afraid of black men these days. This is one of the golden eras of like police violence and the beginnings of extreme mass incarceration. Everyone's afraid of black men these days, they tell me, even black women. Black people are being jailed in huge numbers, and the infant mortality rate is staggering. Courts have authorized custody removal of children at birth from mothers who are drug addicted. Editorials talk about the efficiency of apartheid. Bigger, better prisons, spy satellites, personnel carriers in Harlem, door-to-door searches, state-sanctioned castration, some neutral market thing, devouring the resources of the earth at a terminally reckless rate. And now think a little bit about Williams as a kind of post-Marxist or a late, someone who's influenced by Marx to some extent anyway. The Ku Klux Klan and the Aryan Brotherhood are the major unions among prison guards. Eastern Europe wants more freedom in the form of telephone answering machines and video cassettes. Capitalism spreading across Eastern Europe at this moment after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Velvet Revolution. AIDS spreads and spreads and spreads, and this was so characteristic of this moment in 91, okay? This was so present. Among black and brown communities in particular. True of coronavirus as well. Subsistence farmers and indigenous people are dying all over the world, their ways of knowledge devoured and lost forever. According to the most authoritative scientists, the greenhouse effect is supposed to raise the temperature of the Earth by 2 or 3 degrees over the next millennium. That's way optimistic, as it turns out. The winter of 1989 was 5, 10, sometimes 15 degrees above normal all over the world. It is the spring of 1990, as she writes, and we're all worried about the summer to come. So, I mean, in many ways, the situation in 1990 resembles the situation now. And that's pretty prescient, actually. Not that many people were emphasizing climate change, not that many law professors, certainly, in 90. Right? Okay. I don't know if I should talk about the polar bears, Howard Beach. Some of the references I think you should look up. Maybe I won't describe them. For example, she writes quite a bit about the Baby M case. Look that up, Baby M, Mary Beth Whitehead. A surrogate mother, someone hired to be a surrogate mother who then wanted to keep the child. And, it's a, famously complex contract case. So she, as a law professor, she's addressing it. But she's addressing it from the point of view of questions like, can persons be property? And is Baby M owned in this sense? And what does that say about the human status of Mary Beth Whitehead and so on? But that's, you gotta look up Howard Beach. Right? So some of these late 80s references and stuff, they're definitely worth checking out. Okay, so now let's look at a passage on page 8 of the selection. She says this: theoretical legal understanding is characterized in Anglo-American jurisprudence by at least three features of thought and rhetoric. And now, the reason why I think this is relevant, one reason why I think it's relevant to the course, is that when she identifies these three features, problematic features of theoretical legal understanding, as she critiques the rhetoric of law, it applies to the rhetoric of the sort of philosophy that we've been reading all semester, maybe even more clearly, or quite as clearly, just as clearly as it does to the law. And I think some of the conclusions bear on some of the philosophical positions that we've looked at. Okay, so three features of thought and rhetoric in theoretical, abstract legal understanding. The hypostatization, making into a thing, taking to be real, objective realities, taking as objective realities, it's actually a Marxist concept, exclusive categories and definitional polarities, the drawing of bright lines and clear taxonomies, such as we've seen in various dimensions and various figures, right? Like the taxonomies of political systems in Plato and Aristotle, for example, that purport to make life simpler in the face of life's complications, especially dualistic structures like rights versus needs, moral versus immoral, public versus private, and white and black. So one thing she's doing, I think, from this point of view of this kind of flowing, very present subject position, is holding that those are complex dimensions rather than clearly definable dualisms. Right? And you might think, again, of some of the things that Virginia Held says from a feminist standpoint. Okay, so that's number one. That's a little bit difficult, I admit, because I couldn't even pronounce hypostatization. The existence of transcendent, number two, is the existence of transcendent, acontextual, universal legal truths or pure procedures. For example, some conservative theorists might insist that the tort of fraud, the crime of fraud, has always existed and that it is part of the universal system of right and wrong. Okay, so just the idea, for example, and this is certainly true of Plato, for example, and true of virtually everyone we read, this is not emerging from a particular moment. These my thoughts do not represent the culture from which I emerged. All right? They're not about my history. They are abstract truths that I can establish by pure deductive reasoning, all right? Or not deductive exactly, but in Hobbes and Locke, right? Like anybody in a state of nature, Hobbes thinks, would reach a social contract of the sort that he specifies. Locke thinks the same. All rational creatures creatures of any kind, anywhere, as long as they're rational, right? Men, women, black, white, Africa, Europe, right? The Americas, they would all reach the same conclusion were they rational, because I'm talking about the objective universal truth. And she's claiming that speaking as that, for that, taking oneself to speak for the abstract universally valid truth and not from any particular subject position, any particular cultural location, any particular racial or gender identity, is a delusion. Well, if that is a delusion, or maybe it's a beautiful aspiration to speak universally, but if it is a delusion, then boy, the text that we've read, including maybe Nussbaum, I don't know, maybe not, engaged in that illusion pretty elaborately. The more serious side, she says, of this essentialized worldview is a abstract general worldview, is a worrisome tendency to disparage anything that is non-transcendent, temporal, historical, or contextual, socially constructed, or non-universal, specific as emotional, literary, personal, or just not true. And again, she's enacting a critique of that right here, okay? She's going to go like, this is intensely personal, intensely subjective in a certain way, intensely culturally located. And I think it's moving toward truths that are not available from this kind of delusory, unmarked subject position, which is number 3. The aspects of theoretical legal understanding. The existence of objective, unmediated voices by which those transcendent universal truths find their expression. So the voice of John Locke or Thomas Hobbes or Aristotle speaking from on high. Judges, lawyers, logicians, and practitioners of empirical methodologies, scientists are obvious examples, but the supposed existence of such voices, unmediated, unmarked, neutral, objective voices, is also given power in romanticized notions of real people having real experiences. Not because real people have experienced what they really experienced, but because their experiences are somehow made legitimate, either because they are viewed as empirically legitimate, directly corroborated by a consensus by a community of outsiders, or more frequently because those experiences are corroborated by hidden or unspoken models of legitimacy. So maybe that's even what's happening right now when I teach Patricia Williams at Dickinson College. I mean, I don't know, maybe I should share all my moves today and various problems, but that would take us a while. All right. Okay, and so she suggests, she suggests them, fairly casually. This is an introduction to a longer work. But, certain dimensions of criticism of that point of view. So she says that, this is on page 10, that life is complicated is a fact of great analytic importance. And she's accusing the legal tradition, especially at its more abstract, generalized moments, and I think, probably also the political philosophical tradition of ignoring the realities or complexities, the thickness of life, the cultural location of each of us, and the thoroughness with which we see the world from that location, or the impossibility of seeing it from no location or from every location simultaneously. The impossibility of us escaping ourselves. Law too often seeks to avoid this truth, that life is complicated, by making up its own breed of narrower, simpler, but hypnotically powerful rhetorical truths. Acknowledging, challenging, and playing with these as rhetorical gestures, and for example, the idea of contract and the idea of property, it seems to me, is necessary for any conception of justice. All right. So she's claiming that to get a decent conception of justice, the kind of procedure maybe that John Rawls followed, we didn't read this, but I've talked about it in various contexts, including handouts and so on. At the abstract general level, that will not give you an adequate account of justice, because you have to take into account the actual cultural locations and the actual effects of your abstract concepts, such as property and contract, on actual people in the real world, where there's all these dimensions of oppression, for one thing, that don't even register at this abstract general level. And abstract general solutions to them, like Rawls saying, like, we got to, or even Plato saying, like, we have to redistribute goods in certain ways, don't adequately take into account the thick histories and identities of the people involved, which are the primary facts, actually, as you're trying to actually accomplish something just in the world. And, the law is, the legal system is supposed to be that, accomplishing justice, day by day in the world. All right. I'm going to just read a couple more passages. I can't really do justice to this in 35 minutes or whatever I'm making as the limit. But let me read a couple more passages from the intro, the first bit of the two selections. This is on page 12. This semester, I, Patricia J. Williams, have been teaching a course entitled Women and Notions of Property. And she's going to say, she's arguing implicitly that property seen from a woman's perspective rings somewhat differently, possibly has a oppressive rather than a liberatory flavor, okay, when seen through the eye, seen through race and gender, seen as relevant to those. I have been focusing on the semantic power and property of individualistic gendered perspectives in her course. Gender, in this instance, having less to do with biology, but the biology of male and female, than with the semiotics of power relations. And she says on the next page that gender might be a matter of words. Okay, so she's rolling a social constructionist view of gender, which would certainly be an interesting, this would be an example of third wave feminism, like maybe the sort of feminism that you get after Held, people like Held, where she's kind of saying like there's something that's, she's hinting that there is something that is essential to women's experience, like it's motherhood in this case, that's kind of naturally definitive of women's experience, or maybe directs women to modes of connection rather than individualism or something. All right. Now, under the influence of figures like Judith Butler in the late 80s, many feminists started thinking quite differently than that by the time Williams is writing. And she indicates that she agrees with this, I guess, in some ways. That gender is a social construction, okay? Or that maybe even just, and one way that it is constructed is as a power asymmetry. Right? And then it's maybe like held to be natural to make the power difference seem inevitable. That's the kind of position that would be incredibly controversial at any moment in feminism, and it's still incredibly controversial. But Williams does take it up and at least experiments with it in this text. Okay. Gender in this instance having less to do with the biology of male and female than with the semiotics, the sign systems of power relations, of dominance and submission, of assertion and deference, of big and little, as well as on gender issues specifically based in biology, such as reproductive rights and the complicated ability of women in particular to live freely in the territory of their own bodies. Walking down Fifth Avenue in New York not long ago, I came up behind a couple and their young son. I hope you're enjoying the bird song. Is my lecture like the cheeping of little birds in the spring? Ah, yes. The child, about 4 or 5 years old, had evidently been complaining about big dogs. The mother was saying, "But why are you afraid of big dogs?" "Because they're big," he responded, with eminent good sense. "But what's the difference between a big dog and a little dog?" the father persisted. "They're big," said the child. "But there's really no difference," said the mother, pointing to a large slathering wolfhound with narrow eyes and the calculated amble of a gangster. And she's a writer, okay? Like, and I guess I enjoy it for one thing, which is not incompatible with learning something. And then to a beribboned Pekinese the size of a roller skate who was flouncing along just ahead of us all in that little foxtrotty step that keep Pekinese from ever being taken seriously. "See," said the father, "if you look really closely, you'll see that there's no difference at all. They're all just dogs." And I thought, talk about your ironclad canon, C-O-N-O-N. Talk about a static, unyielding, totally uncompromising point of reference. These people must be lawyers or philosophers. I could see like a parody of Plato along these lines. Okay. all dogs are dogs because they all share in the form of dogness itself or whatever. Like being a dog is an abstract concept. All dogs are the same in that sense. All right, they have the same essence. Where else do people learn so well from the law the idiocies of high objectivity? Like, so this is an example, a nice little example geared to an anecdote of this unmarked objective standpoint, which is the father taking us up. Like, there's no significant difference, no relevant difference between a Pekinese and a wolfhound, except that one will rip your face off and one won't. Right? One could and one couldn't. Okay. How else do people learn to capitulate so uncritically? How else but by studying law? Do people learn to capitulate so uncritically to a norm that refuses to allow for difference? How else do grown-ups sink so deeply into the authoritarianism of their own worldview that they can universalize their relative bigness so completely that they obliterate the subject positioning of the child's relative smallness? So the father takes himself to have the objective, neutral, true position. But the father has a certain size as well as the child. Okay, he speaks from a certain position, one where the wolfhound doesn't seem as big as it does to the child. So how big you are is relevant. Like what your actual subject position is relevant. All right, I was going to finish up maybe with just one more example of her prose style. This is on page 233. We have two different sections of this. She says that in the law, rights are islands of empowerment. To be unrighted is to be disempowered, and recall the centrality of rights to the classical liberal tradition, and particularly, as we've seen, to the philosophy of John Locke, and the critique of that in Marx, for example, and also in Held, and the defense of it in Nussbaum. And the line between rights and no rights is most often the line between dominators and oppressed people. Rights contain images of power, and manipulating those images, either visually or linguistically, rights contain images of power, is central in the making and maintenance of rights. These are things we make, not things that are natural to us, according to Williams. They're cultural productions. And emerge from and are applied to certain subject or cultural positions. In principle, therefore, the more dizzyingly diverse the images that are propagated, the more empowered we will be as a society. In reality, as opposed to the world of abstract concepts, it was a lovely polar bear afternoon, the gentle force of the earth, a wide wilderness of islands, a conspiracy of polar bears lost in timeless forgetting, a gentleness of polar bears, a fruitfulness of polar bears, a silent black-eyed interest of polar bears, a bristled expectancy of polar bears. All right, polar bears run through the whole book, and you can try to figure out what's going on there. What a wild piece of writing, though. Okay? And that's interesting, and maybe it's potentially relevant to what she means, and maybe it makes the critique more effective, or maybe it makes someone dismiss her critique. I don't know. To make a move like that, I think it's interesting. I think the moment is important, where the stuff becomes personal, even to a law professor, okay, at Columbia University, teaching torts and contracts. Like the social contract. All right, I'm going to try to do one more like sort of summary or run through the essay topics of the final, which you'll be getting in a few days. And meanwhile, hang in there. I hope everything will be all right. Enjoy the weather if you get one like this.